Welcome to our R2v3 webinar series where we do a read along with you. We will be going through core requirements and through, Mike, can you help me again?
Sure.
What are we calling these different parts of R2 now?
Section 1 of the standard is the 10 core requirements, and Section 2 of the standard is the process requirements, the Appendix A through F.
Yes. So, okay, so now that we know that R2 is structured differently, R2v3 is structured differently than the previous version, today we are going through core requirement 3, which is part of section 1. And so just like we did before, we're going to have Asal read the sections, and then we're going to discuss each of them, dive deep, interpret what it means, and then talk about different ways to implement and or transition. So Asal.
Yeah, so here we go. Yeah. Core requirement 3 is entitled the EH&S Management System. EH&S, of course, stands for Environmental Health and Safety. So the general principle: to maintain a certified environmental health and safety management system, to plan, implement, and monitor environmental health and safety practices, including the activities to conform to each requirement of the R2 standard. So Mike, Maya, let's talk about this. So we have the R2 facility has to also be certified to other standards, correct?
This is correct. And this isn't a new requirement. That was required under R2 2013 as well. I think we'll get into it. It's very straightforward. To be R2 2013, you have to be also certified to other standards as well, and we'll get into that as we get into sections A, B, and C.
Okay, so core requirement 3 subsection A says an R2 facility shall be certified by an accredited certification body to one or more of the approved EHSMS standards to plan and manage the environmental health and safety aspects of its operations.
Again, this is not anything different from R2 2013. And I think, let's see, it doesn't actually state ISO 14001 or ISO 45001. It just says, due to changes over time, approved EHSMS standards and accepted combinations are maintained on the SERI website. So we can just go to SERI website, and I think there we will see ISO 14001, ISO 45001, and RIOS.
Okay.
And I believe there's also like the Australian and New Zealand counterpart too. But the intent and why they did that with just the 2 rather than with the subscript number 2 and reference to the SERI website is because, you know, standards change in their version. There may be some more that become available. And I think it's also important to the wording, the accredited certification body. So certification bodies that are able to issue certificates should be accredited by a national accreditation board in the country in which they operate or countries in which they operate. So for instance, in the US, it's ANAB, which is American National Standard Institute National Accreditation Board, and in UK, it's UCAS. So those things need to be on the certificate. There are other ones that do accredit certification bodies, but generally ANAB is the one that is recognized in the US.
Mm-hmm. And how do I know if the person I'm sourcing, the accreditation body I'm sourcing, is accredited? Would it be on maybe their company website?
It should be on their company website, and it also should appear on their certificates. If they're under one of the national there's the International Accreditation Forum, which actually accredits all these national accreditation boards. So you should look for a symbol from the IAF or the national one on the certificate or on the certification body's website.
Okay.
Actually, so that's one thing that we should do. We should probably have a webinar how to search for an accredited certification body. But one of the ways that you can also find out is price. If somebody's offering you a certificate for $1,000, it is not an accredited certificate.
Yeah. Unfortunately, sorry.
Unfortunately, yeah, these are pricey.
So subsection B says an R2 facility shall fully integrate the requirements of this R2 standard into the EHSMS, including maintaining all documents and records necessary to demonstrate conformance with each of the R2 requirements, and review the system at least annually through internal audits. So is this basically telling me I need to have an integrated management system, correct?
Yes, it is. And being able to show how you conform to each of the core requirements in section 1 and each of the process requirements that is applicable to your respective R2 facility, and do internal audits at least annually.
Okay.
So the way that I read this is like, hey, have a document control process, have a record control process, have an internal audit process, and document how it is that you are complying with these requirements.
Okay.
So it's kind of like, this is a really loaded. This is really loaded, I think. There's a lot of things that can be written against this if you're an auditor, right? But if you previously have R2, then I think that this is very easy to meet this requirement.
Sure. And moving on to subsection C, an R2 facility shall ensure that all documents and records required to demonstrate conformance with this R2 standard are readily available at the certified facility and maintained for a minimum of 3 years.
So this one, first thing that comes to mind here is I'm thinking of how the previous standard had 13 provisions, and now we have 10 core requirements here. So there's pieces of core requirement 13, which was record keeping before, and that basically just said that the R2 facility shall have all their documents and records at one location, or something to that effect. And also provision 7 under R2 2013 was tracking throughput, which says that you needed to maintain bill of ladings for a minimum of 3 years. So now this is going further and saying that all documents and records required to demonstrate conformance with the R2 standard be maintained for a minimum of 3 years. So that's a new requirement. Before it only specifically called out bill of ladings or other commercially acceptable kind of transportation documentation or shipping documentation, if you will.
Yeah.
I have nothing to add to that. That's pretty good. Yep.
I just want to point out that or ask about that the documents be available at the certified facility, right? So they need to be at the certified facility or be able to be accessed from the certified facility, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, so they don't need to be there like a physical copy. It might, the physical copy might be kept at a headquarters facility and, you know, like a archive room or however they want to do it. But, you know, if at the time of the audit, you know, they need to be able to present evidence to show that they have access to 3 years of these records, either through electronic, or if they don't have any electronic copies, then the physical copies need to be present at that facility.
Right. And if I had an R2 facility and my prior record control procedure was that I would destroy certain records after 1 year, for example, what happens when I need to carry over to the new standard? So let's say I don't have the previous 3 years of records for certain things, not tracking throughput, but outside of that, that wasn't previously mentioned in the R2 standard. What do you think the transition is going to look like there? Do you think an auditor will require the 3 years of records, or as long as your process redefines that your record control procedure has a minimum 3-year requirement. Would that be okay?
Well, I think it's saying necessary to demonstrate conformance with the R2 standard. So it would be specific things that are related to these core provisions here. So it's you might have like your facility inspections or your like maintenance records and other things like, well, I think facility inspection, since it probably has to do with somewhat of your legal compliance, might then be required to be kept for 3 years. And then things like maintenance records, I mean, to a certain extent, it's hard to say without really combing through all the standard, but there might be certain records that you're able to still get away with getting rid of after 1 year or however long you think is appropriate for your organization. These are things that are really kept to really show conformance to the R2 requirements here. So I think we have to go through and look like the legal and other requirements. Stuff like that would be for sure necessary to keep for 3 years, but other things maybe not. So it's hard to say. It depends on each R2 facility. You need to make a determination whether or not that is something that goes to a core requirement or not.
And so also I wanted to add to that. So Asal, I think to answer your question, if I'm transitioning from R2v 2013 to R2v3 and I don't have records other than BOLs that go 3 years back, what's going to happen during my audit, right?
Yeah.
I think that depends on the auditor and what it is that SERI and their certification body directs. I would say if you are already certified to R2 2013, that I don't see, like for example, none of our clients have only 1 year records, right? They all have multiple years of records, especially because most of them are nowadays electronic, so you can go backwards however many years you need to, right? And also because they have requirements to have ISO 14001, for example, which also there you'll have to define your record retention time. So I don't foresee that being a problem, but if it's a problem, I would say this is where auditors, both internal auditors and external auditors, depending on the directives from SERI and their certification body, have to really be pragmatic about it, right? So they have to assess the situation and really determine what is the best finding. Is that just like, oh yeah, so they're just transitioning, so this is okay right now, but in 3 years they definitely have to check, to say that see that they're keeping up their records for 3 years, right? Or if their record system is really broken, and you can show that outside of the transition, then yeah, sure, you write a nonconformity against that, right? So I think that all depends on these factors, and we really can't foresee what's going to happen until we really start getting into the auditing process.
Yeah. So I'm moving on to the second general principle in this section, to use practices and controls designed to protect the health and safety of workers, the public, and the environment under both normal and reasonably foreseeable exceptional circumstances.
So yeah, this goes to what used to be in provision 4 to a certain extent. The top portion, general principle of core requirement 3, just used to be simply stated in provision 1 here. So this one is going into a little bit more depth about how the environmental health and safety management system should be maintained.
Okay. So subsection D1, an R2 facility shall demonstrate the expertise, knowledge, and technical capability to process each type of electronic equipment, component, and material it accepts in a manner that takes into account legal compliance, as well as the need to protect the health and safety of workers, the public, and the environment.
So this is a new requirement here to be able to demonstrate the expertise, knowledge, and technical capability to process each type of equipment, component, and material. So, you know, I mean, obviously the business is doing it, so they have the expertise, knowledge, and technical capability. It doesn't necessarily say that it needs to be documented, but it probably should be documented in some way or another. Having a procedure or a process in place to show how it's done in a way does demonstrate the expertise, knowledge, and technical capability that you can process that type of equipment, components, or materials. To know how to do the dismantling, to know how to do the repair or the refurbishment of a type of material shows that you have the expertise to do it, but also a robust legal compliance audit and a really robust environmental health and safety management system is going to help to show, you know, that, and that's done through your compliance audit and your internal audit to show that these things are really being considered in each of your respective processes. So this is tying in your processes with the legal compliance and environmental health and safety management system and how they tie in together. So this is really when it says like a R2 facility shall fully integrate the requirements of the R2 standard into the EHSMS. This is what this is talking about here. Each of the respective processes that is done at the R2 facility really need to take into account what are the legal requirements for what they're doing and how is it considering the important environmental impacts and the health and safety risk at the facility.
And the only thing that I have to add to that is that during the audit, sure, the auditor is going to want to take a look at those processes and procedures that are written, right? But this is also where the observation comes into place. This is why part of the management standards is write what you do and do what you say. So this is where they will observe. So part of the audit process for D1 is really to stand there and observe every process and interview individuals to assess the effectiveness of implementation of those processes, right? And conformance, right? So I think that's something to keep in mind here.
Okay. D2, the R2 facility shall identify, analyze, and demonstrate effective controls of important environmental impacts and health and safety risks that it can control and those that it can influence, both internal to the R2 facility and through its recycling chain activities.
So this is a part of both the RIOS as well as ISO 14001 and 45001. The word they used here is from the RIOS standard, which calls it important environmental impacts, important health and safety risk. And those are the ones that are called significant aspects or significant risk under the ISO 45001 and ISO 14001 standards. So, and it's already required under those standards to identify, analyze, and have controls in place. But this one, the R2 standard here says demonstrate effective controls. So that's going a little bit further and kind of showing how are you monitoring and measuring the controls that you have in place for the important environmental impacts and important health and safety risks that you can control at your facility or that you can influence both internally and through the recycling chain. So some of these things might be having how this is practically implemented could be having some of those as your key performance indicators, the things that you consider to be your significant or important environmental impacts or health and safety risks. And that could be something like measuring accidents, measuring kind of environmental incidents at your facility or anything like that, the amount of material that's shipped out, the amount of resource usage or anything like that, is because those are things that are likely going to be identified as your important environmental impacts. So what are you doing to demonstrate that you're effectively controlling them or working towards minimizing and reducing, and if at all possible, eliminating those impacts and risks from your facility. And I think it's also interesting that it kind of extends it further to more than just the facility, but what the facility can influence both internally and through the recycling chain. So how you handle material can have an environmental impact down the recycling chain. And also, you know, like reuse is the highest form of recycling. So that is something that can be shown down the recycling chain because you can influence what you do at your facility to reduce the environmental impact.
And another way that you can affect environmental impact through your recycling chain is whether or not you are removing button batteries prior to sending them for recovery, right? So
yes.
This is where it's important to really remove all of the FMs and handle them, focus materials for those first time to R2. Handle your focus materials in an environmentally safe manner within your facility prior, and labeling and packaging prior to sending them further down the stream. Because if these materials are not handled properly, packaged and labeled within your facility properly, then they may have a negative environmental and health and safety impact, whether it's on the road or upon receiving and processing in the destination facility.
Okay. Okay. And can my procedures just be kind of the control that I am applying my packaging procedure, my dismantling procedure, labeling procedure would be the controls, correct? That would influence down the recycling chain.
Right, and then I think, this also goes through the hierarchy, right, of controls. Do we go over it? No. So the hierarchy of controls for for eliminating risks, right? So first we want to see can we eliminate it? Can we engineer it? Do we need a procedure? Can we train it? Right? So yeah, definitely one of the best methods to control the risks or to minimize the effect of the risk would be to write a procedure for that and train the personnel and to make sure that the procedure is implemented effectively in order to minimize those risks.
Okay. Anything else to add with regards to this section?
No.
Okay, so now I'm going to read D3. Maintain a process to periodically evaluate the risk of exposure to hazardous substances such as mercury, lead, beryllium, cadmium, PCBs, phosphor compounds, flame retardants, silica dust, hexavalent chromium through processing or handling of electronic equipment components and materials.
So this is a new requirement here, and I think the key word is a process to periodically evaluate the risk of exposure, right? So it doesn't say that you have to periodically test or do some type of air testing, blood test, whatever like that. So if your facility is putting workers, if the R2 facility is putting workers at risk to exposure to these hazardous substances, then they should have a process in place to do the air testing, to do the blood testing, and do stuff like that. But if it's like a facility that like repairs and fixes good cell phones and they don't ever, do any shredding, or they're really not, no soldering, nothing that's really doing anything to cause any type of these heavy metals and other hazardous compounds and substances found in electronics to workers, then they need to be able to show that they've evaluated and documented the risks. So that might be something that is demonstrated above in their like impacts and risk assessment, or it could be in a separate kind of analysis for the SWOT or risk and opportunities, however they have that documented there, to show like that this is what the facility does, and this is the potential type of risk of exposure to hazardous substances, and this is what we're doing to make sure that workers aren't affected, or that we have effective controls in place to make sure that the exposure is minimal and, you know, controlled.
Okay. Maya?
I will not add anything to this one.
Okay. Okay, so D4, maintain processes to visually inspect electronic equipment and components received and handled for any conditions or damage that may result in adverse environmental, health, or safety incidents during handling, storage, or processing of the equipment, and controls for the containment, segregation, and storage of items requiring special handling. What are items requiring special handling? What's an example of that?
So for instance, swollen batteries, stuff that is, you know, is coming in that is not acceptable by the facility. Any type of hazardous waste, medical waste, or stuff that's like illegal to take in, depending on the facility. You know, the like certain types of materials that are potentially stolen. You know, there's legislation and requirements in various places that have, like, you know, you can't take whole propane tanks or whole kegs or various other types of material that could be potentially stolen. So all of that depends on the facility determining what is the kind of general type of material that they have coming in, and how do they inspect and ensure that the material is in a good condition to go to the next process and doesn't require any special type of kind of treatment at the time of the receiving visual inspection. So
quarantine.
Huh?
I'm yearning to say the quarantine.
Oh, the quarantine. Yeah, it's kind of like the non-conforming product area, right? This is really going to that. And
this is where we're saying, okay, like, hey, outside of, you know, 2020, we still have to have quarantine processes within our facility.
Mm-hmm.
Do the quarantine within the quarantine. So, yeah, this is the, I mean, I would say a majority of times it's going to be something like, for instance, broken CRT coming in, or some type of
bulbs, right? Light bulbs.
Yeah, broken bulbs, or, you know, any type of battery that you can visually see is kind of swollen, or God forbid on fire, or anything, you know,
or not labeled
out of the ordinary. Yes.
Yeah, or containers that have fluid in them, but they have no labels on that. So
yeah,
you have to quarantine that. You don't know what's inside.
So this was under provision 4B4, where it kind of talked about responding to exceptional releases, and you know, how do you handle the material that you don't usually receive at the facility. So I think that's the main idea here, and it kind of expands on it, and you know, is forcing the R2 recycler, or R2 facility, I should say, to have a process in place for how they handle this type of thing.
Right. So D5, adhere to good housekeeping standards, including keeping all work and storage areas clean and orderly. Housekeeping for all areas of the facility shall be planned, regularly implemented, and monitored. This would be a new requirement, correct?
This is a new requirement here.
Half of it is new.
Half and half, I suppose. But the way that specifically calling out for housekeeping to be planned, regularly implemented, and monitored is new, you know. And I think it's a good practice. A lot of facilities already have this in place for other reasons, either internal reasons or regulatory reasons. A lot of people have housekeeping schedules in place for stormwater purposes, at least the material that they're storing outside. And it could be for every type of, it could go to OSHA requirements or EPA requirements or any type of stormwater requirements, because usually those things are things that you need to make sure that you have good housekeeping in place. It prevents environmental degradation as well as accidents.
And worker health and safety, correct?
Yes, yeah, accidents.
6D, provide sanitary facilities for workers.
So I think this is good because honestly, I've gone to facilities, and when you go into the restroom in the warehouse, it's really run down, and I don't know. I think it depends on the facility, but it kind of shows what management thinks of the people they have working under them. So this forces a management commitment to the worker health and safety at a real existing level. You know, that's not just like a theoretical thing, but, you know, I think it's something that's important. And going off 7 here, I'll kind of combine the two. Yeah. Prevent the consumption of food and beverages in areas not maintained free of in areas not maintained free of contaminants. So I've seen like just benches in the corner of facilities, you know, and there's no separation. And that again, I think shows about what management thinks of like the people that are working there. If they don't have, they're not making sure that that stuff is separate and free and maintained well, it reflects poorly upon them. So I think it's good that they put this stuff in the standard.
And would this also somewhat overlap with certain OSHA requirements?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
That's my thought. That's exactly what I thought about initially when we were talking all the way up there about, I think it was D3, right? Mm-hmm. I think this is where SERI and the TAC kind of came in, and they're like, okay, so wait a second, what are some of the OSHA requirements related to the type of equipment and the processes that these facilities are doing? And so they just kind of like listed them here.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm. That's why I didn't add anything to D3 up there.
Okay, so D8, provide the same level of care to the entire workforce, including staff, volunteers, consultants, temporary workers, and anyone else performing activities under its direction.
I think this is still going to 6 and 7. So some people might have like a nice, beautiful bathroom for the office workers and a crappy bathroom for the warehouse workers. So you have to provide the same level of care for the entire workforce. You can't like just say, these are the people deserving of good facilities and these are the people who have to live in squalor.
Mm-hmm. Maya, anything to add to that? You look like you had something to add. Okay. D9, designate a qualified employee or contract worker to coordinate its efforts to promote worker health and safety and environmental protection. This designated individual shall be identified to all employees, and two-way communication shall be proactive and effective between employees and this individual regarding potential hazards and how best to address them. So this is completely new.
This is, some of it's completely new. I mean, some of it was what was under provision for identifying the health and safety representative before. That was a requirement, but it expands upon the requirement here and goes to the kind of hazard communication and hazard identification elements of a injury and illness prevention program, and also some of the kind of consultation and participation elements of ISO 45001. So to have a proactive and effective communication between employees and how to address potential hazards and stuff like that is, you know, something that is being stressed here specifically. So, you know, all the other, if you're certified to ISO 45001, you kind of need to show that consultation and participation throughout the requirements of the standard, but this is specifically referring to hazard identification and hazard communication. So I think that that is going to be something that you need a little bit more documented evidence to show that you're doing that. Mm-hmm. So participation of the non-managerial employees in identifying hazards, and not just doing it once a year, but being proactive, doing it like, you know, monthly with safety meetings, or when there's a near miss, doing some kind of analysis, or what's your process to show that it's being done proactive and not reactive after an accident has occurred.
Right. So this subsection can easily integrate into ISO 45001 implementation as well.
I believe so, yes.
Maya, anything to add?
No.
Okay. What about for the entire section 3? Anything to add with regards to all of section 3?
I think, isn't it different here, Mike? I thought that section 4, provision 4 of R2 2013 did state the hierarchy. Or am I mixing that up? The hierarchy of like handling the risks, right?
Yeah, it did. It had the hierarchy of controls and elimination, like the.
Right. So I think that's one thing that's not listed on here, which is fine. One thing that I do want to say.
We can go through it here.
Right. So I think I mentioned it earlier when we were talking about the risks, operational controls, right? So the first step is always to eliminate. And then you want to engineer, then you want to see how can you know, what is the process to document it, to train. And then of course, the last step is always PPE. If you cannot change what you're doing, then you have to implement necessary personal protective equipment. And of course, you probably are going to do a combination of those things. You're going to write a procedure, you're going to train, and you're going to implement a PPE, unless you can actually re-engineer the process. Mm-hmm. Or eliminate the risk completely. And one thing that I did want to mention, I do think that this core requirement is more prescriptive than it was before, because it kind of calls out the recycler as well as the consultants to really say, like, to assess, like, no, that doesn't pertain to us. So instead of allowing the organization to identify its risks and determine what operational controls they need to implement, and in order to also to comply with OSHA requirements, this is kind of going backwards, I think. Taking a look at, like, oh, these are all of the potential risks that we have seen in R2 facilities. We're going to make these requirements, and then the recycler is going to have to say whether or not that pertains to them. At least that's how I'm reading this. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, it's much more prescriptive in the way that R2v3 is written, and so we'll see how it works out. I think that was the intent of the TAC, is to be more prescriptive, because they wanted to make sure that certain things were done at respective R2 facilities to create a level playing ground across the board. Mm-hmm. And that's really the only way that you could do that, is by having things that are very prescriptive, because as you said, otherwise they could say, oh, well, that doesn't apply to us.
Right.
So yes,
you actually have to demonstrate it here.
I agree.
You have to demonstrate here. Yeah. Asal, do you have any questions?
No follow-up questions. So thank you for answering my questions. And so for anyone who's watching, if you have any follow-up questions, please email us at info@glenviewgroup.com. And please tune in for the next section, which is the legal and other requirements. Next provision.
Yes.
For requirement.
For requirement.
For requirement. Still learning.
Yes.
Okay, everybody. Bye.
All right. Bye.